It's been said that conflict builds character, but crisis defines it. Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal is certainly an example of that. He's an unlikely leader who's anything but your typical politician. Ephraim Graham explains.
The images we remember all too well. Millions of gallons of crude oil churning out into the Gulf of Mexico. In coordinating the state response to what will become the largest oil spill in history, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal emerged from the crisis as a proven leader, advocating on behalf of the families who lost wages, fighting to protect the environment, and coming up with out-of-the-box solutions to clean up coastal communities and shorelines. In 2008, Jindal became America's youngest sitting governor and immediately started making waves, reforming government, fighting corruption, and trying to prevent the kind of man-made disaster that followed the natural disaster of Hurricane Katrina. In his new book, Leadership in Crisis, Jindal continues to make waves, taking on the president and government bureaucracy with a simple challenge: think like ordinary Americans, to seek common sense solutions, live within their means, and pursue the American dream.
Well, Louisiana Governor Bobby Jindal joins us now from our Washington bureau. Governor, it's good to have you on the 700 Club. Welcome.
Pat, thank you so much for having me, but also thank you for your incredible generosity to our people in Louisiana. We certainly saw that following Hurricanes Katrina, Rita, Gustav, and Ike. You and your viewers have been tremendously generous to our people, and I want to thank you for that.
Well, I received that. We do care. We've been down there. You know, I saw bureaucratic mismanagement in Katrina that was just appalling. How do you compare that to this blowout of the Deepwater Horizon?
Well, unfortunately, our federal government hasn't learned its lesson. We saw the same bureaucracy, the same red tape. I describe in the book a couple of examples. For example, we had oil coming into Timbalier Bay off of our coast. Literally, the federal government had boats, they had skimmers, they had men standing by at Cocodrie. We couldn't get them to deploy their assets. I took the federal government official in charge of the response for our state up in a Black Hawk helicopter on a Friday morning to see the oil for himself, thinking of certainly this would prompt them into action. He sees the oil. I think, great, he's going to order them to move those resources. Pat, he tells me it'll take him 24 to 48 hours to cut through the bureaucracy to mobilize those resources. And what was even more frustrating, when local people came up with great solutions like vacuum trucks on barges to pick up the oil out of the water, and we picked up thousands of gallons of oil, a week later the federal government shut down those barges just so they could do their inspections for 24 hours. They said they wanted to count the life jackets, count the fire extinguishers. Only after media pressure, when they realized how absurd this was, did they cancel their inspections, let those boats go back to work. Here's the frustrating thing. We kept telling them either lead or get out of the way, and the bottom line was we saw some of the same bureaucracy, the same red tape. I would argue when you get a government so big that it's trying to run health care and car companies and banks, you get a government that loses its ability to operate and do its core functions well.
Well, you know, in Katrina, we had a fleet of trucks loaded with food, water, and all that, and there were people at the Superdome crying out for water, and the federal government prohibited us from taking those trucks in to help the people.
The regulations, the red tapes were ridiculous. We literally had, within Louisiana, we had churches open their doors to strangers. We had volunteers show up at shelters to try to bring them food and water, and some bureaucrat told them, well, you can't bring this food. We haven't inspected it yet. They don't let the, they let the common sense get in the way of actually helping people. And I think this is what happens. This is why the founding fathers intended a more limited central government. They never would have imagined a government that now spends 24% of our economy, that has borrowed $14 trillion, and under this president wants to almost double it to $26 trillion. I think the voters a couple of weeks ago were sending a message that they want this Congress, this administration, to shrink government, not just freeze government, shrink the power, the size, the cost of government. The reality is the heroes in Katrina and again during the oil spill, it wasn't our government. We had first responders that did an amazing job. It was a faith-based community. I've got to tell you, Pat, one of the most heartening sights, and I described this in the book, was when literally you had churches put up signs all over the road saying, if you need food, water, or shelter, come here. They didn't care what race you were. They didn't care what denomination you were. They opened their doors, and we had groups like yours literally truck in supplies. We had generous folks all over this country say, we want to help. And so I think you saw, again, what makes America great. It's not our government. It's our people. It's our churches. It's our faith-based organizations. It's the people. That's why the newly elected Congress, this newly elected Congress needs to understand a government that's big enough to give you everything is big enough to take everything away from you.
You pointed out that you think that we should have part-time congressmen. You served 2 terms as a congressman. You saw what goes on up there. What goes on, and how would your solution solve it?
Well, I make several recommendations on how to structurally change Congress, including a balanced budget amendment, including a supermajority before they can raise taxes, line item veto to get rid of the earmarks. But you're right, Pat, one of my most aggressive ideas. We used to pay farmers not to grow crops. Let's pay congressmen not to come to D.C., not to pass bills. Our wallets, our freedoms are safest when they're not in session. The reality is the Founding Fathers intended a part-time Congress. Let's go back to term limits. Let's go back to not allowing them to become lobbyists. If they had to live under the same laws and rules that they pass for everybody else, maybe you'd see some more common sense. Maybe they would understand that we need to grow the private sector, not the government, to make America great again.
I would gladly raise my contribution to the government if it would keep congressmen home. That is a wonderful. I think it would be an overwhelming success.
Well, our wallets, our freedoms are safest. Mark Twain said our wallets and our freedoms are safest when they're out of session. And you know what happens is when they come into session, and by the way, all of these reforms, these are all things we have to live with as governors across the state. Louisiana has these reforms. Many other states have these reforms. The bottom line, though, is when you have full-time legislators, when you have congressmen in D.C., they look for government programs to grow. They look for taxes to raise. They look for money to spend. Pat, they've borrowed $14 trillion. They want to double that to 26. That is our children's money that they are spending. I mean, we must not become the first generation that leaves fewer opportunities for our children than we inherited from our parents. I saw your previous segment. I couldn't agree with you more. I think it's a good thing we as a country are cutting down our debt, but we have a lot more work to do on consumer debt. Our government hasn't even started cutting down its debt.
You pointed out in your book an interesting encounter with political correctness when you were at Brown. Apparently, you had to have training because you opened doors for the ladies.
That's exactly. Well, I wasn't the traditional Brown student. I was the head of college Republicans. I was involved with Campus Crusade for Christ, InterVarsity, and indeed became a Christian while at Brown, and I was officially baptized while at Brown. And what was amazing to me was the political correctness. My residential counselor took me aside and was saying, you open doors for the ladies here. You don't act like everybody else here. And then they told me I had to go to a mandatory orientation session where I was going to have to pretend, in the name of sensitivity training, that the heterosexual men had to pretend to be homosexual men just so we could understand what that was like. I refused to go. I said, there's no way you can make me go to that. They said, well, it's mandatory. I said, well, you can send my father's tuition money back because I'm not going to that. And the reality was, Brown, I had a professor at Brown who started a class by saying, and it wasn't even a religious studies class, Pat, who said, we all know, everybody who is intellectual, who is smart or educated, knows the Bible's not true. And that's one of those moments where you have to decide what's more important to me. Do I want to go along to get along, or am I going to stand up as Jesus promised us? He says, if you're not embarrassed of me on earth, I won't be embarrassed of you when you come to my Father's throne above. So I quickly raised my hand and said, wait a minute. Maybe I'm not educated, but I do believe the Bible to be the true word of God. And time after time, I can't tell you how many times I met students who told me they had never met somebody who was pro-life before. I can't tell you how many students I'd met. And what was disheartening to me was the number of students who had been to some of the best schools in our country who didn't know the basics of Western civilization. They'd never read the Bible before, didn't know the difference between the Old and the New Testament. Now, I do think it was like the Bible talks about metal sharpening metal. I think it was a productive experience for me. It forced me to think about what I believe, why I believed it, because I was constantly being challenged in the dorm rooms, in the classrooms. I'm not suggesting an affirmative action program for conservatives to go to these campuses. I'm not trying to complain about being a victim, but I do think that we as parents, and I've got 3 young children now, we need to be aware of what's happening on our university campuses. We need to be aware of what's happening in those classrooms, because many of us remember the days when the vast majority of the first colleges in this country were set up as seminaries, and it's not that way. It's not that way anymore. The instruction our children are getting is not the same instruction we were received when we were growing up.
They love you in Louisiana. Any chance you'll go for the big one?
Look, there'll be plenty of other people running. We've still got more work to do in my home state. We've cut spending 26%, cut taxes. Portfolio.com says we got the second best economic performance during the recession, but we still have more work to do in Louisiana. We do need a directional change in our country. We do need to reclaim it. And look, Pat, like you, I believe we live in the greatest country in the history of the world. I'm not a cynic or a pessimist about our future, but I also know that we've got to get back to what the Founding Fathers intended. So I wrote Leadership in Crisis, not as a candidate for president, not as a governor, but as a father of 3 young children, very worried about the America we leave behind for them.
Well, I congratulate you on the work you're doing. Bobby Jindal, thank you so much for your book. It's a fascinating read, ladies and gentlemen. It's available on Amazon, wherever books are sold. Leadership and Crisis. You ought to get a copy and read it.
I'm going to.
You. All right. Governor Jindal, again, maybe a candidate. He said he's not, but who knows what the electorate might do in the next couple of years.